My name is Chloe Madison. I'm 26 years old, a commercial pilot, and I come from a family where silence was treated like loyalty, and asking questions was considered betrayal. Flying is the only place I ever felt weightless, not just physically, but emotionally, too. Up there, I'm not the daughter trying to win her father's approval, or the half-sister constantly reminded of where she doesn't quite belong. In the air, I am simply Chloe, capable, focused, in control. But down here, on the ground, things have never been that simple. I was born from a relationship that my father, Charles Madison, would prefer no one mention. His indiscretion, as he once called it, with my mother, Allison, a bright-eyed flight attendant, led to a pregnancy he didn't plan for and never really accepted. He was already married when he met her. And, I was the proof that choices have consequences. My mother raised me alone in a modest apartment in Des Moines, Iowa. She was gentle but tough, working double shifts just to keep me in dance classes and pay for my asthma medication. I didn't know until much later why my last name was Madison. I'd always assumed it was just ours. Turns out, it was a thread connecting me to a life I was never really allowed to be part of. Charles Madison is a man who lives in photographs. I've seen him on magazine covers, handshakes with CEOs, charity galas with his wife Meredith on his arm. Pearls and posture in perfect harmony. He owns an aerospace engineering firm and serves on the board of several aviation companies. He's built an empire that prides itself on legacy. Legacy. That word used to sting. I met him for the first time when I was 12. It wasn't because he wanted to meet me. It was because my mother had just been diagnosed with breast cancer and, terrified of what would happen to me if she didn't survive, she forced the issue through a lawyer. He agreed to a quiet settlement and a few, very controlled visits. I remember the first time I stepped into his mansion like it was yesterday. The air smelled like polish and something colder. That's when I met Meredith, and her two children, me half-siblings Liam and Grace. Liam is 2 years older than me. He's the golden boy. Private school, Ivy League, family business, he checks all the boxes. Grace is younger by 3 years, smart and artistic, but easily swayed by her mother's moods. Meredith didn't look at me like a child her husband had fathered. She looked at me like I was something vulgar that had been dragged in from the street. She didn't speak to me directly for the first 3 years I visited. Not once. Charles didn't exactly shower me with affection either. He gave what he thought was enough: birthday cards with crisp $100 bills, an occasional phone call, and later, tuition money so long as I didn't cause trouble, didn't make demands, didn't speak. I got the message early. Keep your head down, be thankful, don't challenge the narrative. Still, I wanted to belong. I wanted them to see me. Not just the mistake they barely tolerated, but the woman I was becoming. I got my pilot's license at 19, worked my way through school while flying charters on the side. Every achievement I earned, I sent a quiet update to Charles. Sometimes he replied with a thumbs-up emoji. Once, he sent a "proud of you" text. That one, I saved. When my mom passed away 3 years ago, I thought maybe, just maybe, they'd step in. That I'd finally be acknowledged not just as a footnote in Charles Madison's life, but as part of the family. Instead, I got a flower arrangement with a card that said, "Our condolences. Stay strong. The Madisons. The Madisons." As if I wasn't one. I grieved alone. And when the funeral ended and the last car drove off, I stood in the hallway of my childhood apartment, surrounded by boxes, and I made myself a promise. I would make something of myself so undeniable, so unignorable, that they'd have no choice but to see me. And I did. I earned my position as a commercial pilot faster than most, outperformed expectations, got awards I never even thought to aim for. But no matter how high I flew, I could still feel the weight of their silence. And somewhere deep inside me, the question lingered. Why wasn't I ever enough for them? I tried to let it go, to focus on the future. But families like mine don't let you stay silent forever, not when there's an inheritance involved, not when reputations are on the line, not when truths are buried under marble countertops and designer rugs. And the day came quiet, like a storm before a thunder when I was told again, "Don't speak." But I did. And their reputations crumbled. It began with a letter and envelope that arrived on a humid Thursday afternoon, its ivory paper thick and textured, bearing the embossed seal of Madison and Hartwell LLP, the law firm that had represented my father's business interests for as long as I could remember. I had just returned from a grueling 3-day flight rotation, my body still vibrating with the residual hum of jet engines. My mind foggy from time zone shifts and the emotional weight of the anniversary of my mother's passing, which I had spent alone in a hotel room in Denver, staring at the ceiling and trying not to drown in memories. I held the envelope in my hands, its weight disproportionate to its size, as if it carried not just paper but the gravity of decisions made behind closed doors, of conversations I was never privy to, of a family legacy that had always felt just out of reach. My name, Chloe Madison, was written in elegant script, the ink slightly smudged, suggesting haste or perhaps a tremor in the hand that addressed it. Inside, the letter was brief. Dear Miss Madison, we are writing to inform you that Charles Madison has recently updated his estate plan. As part of this process, certain adjustments have been made concerning the distribution of assets. While we understand this may come as unexpected, please be advised that these changes are final and legally binding. Should you have any questions, we recommend you consult with independent legal counsel. Sincerely, Jonathan Hartwell. Madison and Hartwell LLP. There was no explanation, no detail, just a cold, clinical notification that something had shifted, that the already tenuous thread connecting me to my father's world had been further frayed. I sat on the edge of my couch, the letter trembling in my hands, 1,000 questions swirling in my mind, each one more painful than the last. I reached for my phone, my fingers hesitating over the screen before I finally dialed the number I had memorized but rarely used. The line rang twice before a familiar voice answered. "Hello, this is Charles Madison." "Dad, it's Chloe," I said, my voice steadier than I felt. There was a pause, a beat too long, before he responded. "Chloe, what can I do for you? I received a letter from your lawyers today. About changes to your estate plan." Another pause. "Yes, I thought they would have contacted you by now. Can you explain what's going on?" "It's complicated," he said, his tone dismissive. "There have been some adjustments to ensure the company's stability and the family's future." "I'm part of the family," I said, the words catching in my throat. "Chloe, you've always been independent. You've made a life for yourself. This doesn't change that. But it changes everything else," I whispered. "I have to go," he said abruptly. "We'll talk another time." The line went dead. I stared at the phone, the dial tone echoing in my ears, a hollow sound that mirrored the emptiness spreading in my chest. I felt like a child again, standing outside the gates of a world I was never truly allowed to enter, knocking on doors that would never open. The next day, I received a call from my half-brother, Liam. "Chloe," he said, his voice tight. "I heard you called Dad. I wanted to understand why I was being excluded." "Oh, it's not about exclusion," he said quickly. "It's about practicality. The company needs to remain within the primary family line. I am part of that line. You know what I mean?" "No, Liam, I don't. Enlighten me." He sighed. "Look, this isn't personal, it's business. You've always been on the periphery. This just formalizes it." "Periphery," I repeated, the word tasting bitter on my tongue. "Don't make this harder than it needs to be," he said. "Accept it and move on." R2. I hung up without responding, my hands shaking, my heart pounding with a mix of anger, hurt, and betrayal. The walls of my apartment seemed to close in around me, the air thick with the weight of rejection. That night, I sat at my desk, the letter from the law firm spread out before me, alongside old photographs of my mother and me, memories of a life built on resilience and love, even in the absence of acknowledgement from the man who had fathered me. I thought about the sacrifices my mother had made, the strength she had shown, and the dreams she had for me. I realized then that this wasn't just about money or inheritance. It was about identity, about recognition, about the right to claim my place in a family that had always kept me at arm's length. I had spent my life trying to earn their acceptance, believing that if I achieved enough, succeeded enough, I would be seen, acknowledged, loved. But now, I saw the truth. Their silence, their exclusion, was a choice, a deliberate act to erase me from the narrative, to pretend I didn't exist. I wouldn't let them. I would speak. And when I did, their carefully constructed facade would crumble. I didn't cry right away. I didn't scream or throw anything. I just sat there in silence, holding that paper like it could somehow warm the cold growing in my chest, like it could explain why a man I had spent my life trying to make proud had chosen, once again, to pretend I didn't belong. There was something devastatingly final in that letter, not just in what it said, but in what it implied that there had been a conversation, probably several. Decisions made in polished offices and hushed living rooms, over drinks and after dinner, and I hadn't been invited to any of it. I was invisible to them. Not an oversight. A deliberate omission. I couldn't stop wondering what the meeting must have looked like. Maybe Meredith sat beside my father, her hand resting gently on his, her voice sweet and full of concern as she suggested, with practiced elegance, that keeping the inheritance within the core family would be best for appearances, for simplicity. Maybe Liam leaned in with that smug, corporate calm he'd perfected, pretending this was all about structure and long-term strategy. Grace, if she was even there, probably said nothing she never did, not when it mattered. And me? I was nowhere. Not even in the footnotes. The worst part wasn't the money. I've never been someone who measured worth by wealth. It wasn't about the estate or the assets or the name on the shares. It was about being erased. About the years I spent sending birthday texts that went unanswered. About calling to share that I'd landed a regional captain position and getting a 2-word response. Good job. About flying over cities where I knew my father was attending some gala or conference and feeling the weight of knowing I was close enough to touch his life but never allowed inside it. That weekend, I tried to act normal. I met my best friend, Rachel, for coffee. She knew something was wrong the second I walked in. Jesus, Chloe. You look like you've been hit by a truck. I forced a smile, sat down, and tried to say it casually. My dad rewrote his will, cut me out of everything. That or? Rachel blinked. Everything? Everything, I said, my voice flat. Liam and Grace get the company, the trust, the properties. I get nothing. Not even a mention. She stared at me for a long second. Are you freaking kidding me? I shook my head. Nope. It's official, I'm the family secret again. Rachel was furious in a way I hadn't let myself be yet. This is disgusting. Do you want me to torch his car? I swear to God, Chloe. I don't want revenge, I said quietly. I just wanted to matter. And there it was. The truth sitting raw and bare on a coffee shop table between 2 paper cups and a half-eaten muffin. I didn't want the money. I wanted to be seen. I wanted my father to say, just once, that I was his daughter and he was proud. That despite everything, I was part of his story. Later that evening, I sat by the window in my apartment, the city below glowing with indifferent lights, and I let the hurt roll over me like a tide. I remembered every small slight, every gathering I wasn't invited to, every family photo where I didn't exist. I remembered how Liam had once told me when we were both teenagers. It's nothing personal, Chloe. It's just that you don't really fit in. As if my existence was an error they had to tolerate, not a human being they were obligated to love. I pulled out a box from the top of my closet, one I hadn't opened in years. Inside were old photos, cards from my mom, a few trinkets from the early days when I still believed things might change. There was a letter she'd written but never sent, addressed to Charles. Her handwriting was elegant but tired. Dear Charles, I'm not asking for anything but decency. Chloe is your daughter. She may not have come from the life you planned, but she deserves your care. I'm raising her alone, and I'm not ashamed of that, but someday she'll have questions. Please don't let her grow up thinking she was a mistake. I read those words 3 times, the pain hitting in waves. My mother had fought for me even when she was sick, even when she was tired, even when she was afraid. She had tried to build a bridge across the distance Charles never truly wanted to close. And now she was gone, and I was standing on one side of a chasm they had no intention of bridging. The exclusion wasn't just in the will, it was in the way Liam's name came up in industry panels and articles as the heir apparent to Madison Aerodynamics. In the way my father's LinkedIn listed Grace as a creative force in the family's philanthropic branch, but didn't list me at all. It was in the silence, the deliberate looking away. I wanted to scream. But instead, I made tea. I sat with that pain because I knew if I buried it again, I would never do what needed to be done. They had drawn the line, made it clear where I stood. But I wasn't going to shrink back this time. I wasn't going to be the good daughter who stayed quiet, who accepted scraps, who let them rewrite the truth just because it was convenient. They wanted me to be invisible. I was done disappearing. The thing about injustice is that it rarely arrives all at once, in a thunderclap of betrayal or a single devastating blow. It trickles in like a slow, steady leak, quietly soaking into the floorboards of your life until one day you're standing ankle-deep in a flood, wondering how long ago everything started rotting beneath your feet. I didn't realize, not fully, how much I had already lost, not just material things or legal rights, but the small human dignities, the silent gestures of inclusion that people with real families take for granted, until I started speaking up, asking questions, peeling back the veil of polite avoidance that had kept me half blind for most of my life. It started with the estate letter, yes, but that was just the match. I hadn't yet realized how dry and brittle the structure around me already was. A few days after that first call with my father, I received another letter, this one from a different firm entirely, sent by Liam's personal legal team. And this one was written in the kind of legalese that made my stomach twist. It was a notice of intent to formalize succession structure, essentially outlining how, effective immediately, all business and family trust decisions would be made exclusively by Charles, Liam, and Grace, with no formal role or influence afforded to me, given lack of primary lineage and historical distance from core family operations. I read that line again and again, unable to breathe for a moment. Not primary lineage. Historical distance. It was all a euphemism for illegitimate, unwanted, easily cut out. I emailed back asking for clarification, trying to keep my voice professional, calm, but I got nothing but a curt response from an assistant. All decisions are final as per the board resolution. There it was again, that cold word. Final, no room for appeal, no space for humanity. The next blow came from Grace. Of all people, someone I had once believed might be an ally if only she could muster the courage to stand up to her mother. I texted her one evening, nothing dramatic, just, "Hey, Grace, can we talk? I'm feeling a bit overwhelmed and just need to understand what's going on." It showed red almost instantly. She didn't reply. Not that night, not the next. When she finally responded, it was 3 days later, and all she wrote was, "Sorry. This isn't my decision. I can't get involved." Get involved, like it was a war. Like my existence was a scandalous mess she didn't want her fingerprints on. I stared at her message for a long time, heart pounding in that quiet, humiliated way it does when you realize someone you once cared about would rather preserve her place at the table than acknowledge your hunger. From there, the floodgates opened. I learned that they had held a family meeting weeks earlier. Everyone had been there except me. Meredith had hosted it at their lake house in Vermont. I found out through social media, ironically, not through spying or sleuthing, just scrolling through the tagged photos that one of Liam's friends had posted without much thought. A picture of them all laughing around a fire pit, drinks in hand, the caption reading "Madison Legacy Planning Weekend." As if excluding someone from their birthright was a fun retreat activity, like kayaking or charades. In the following days, I tried to reach out to my father again, this time not as a confused daughter, but as a woman demanding clarity. I wrote him a letter, real paper, real pen. I poured my heart into it, choosing my words with care but refusing to dilute my pain. I told him how much it hurt to be treated like a mistake he could erase with signatures and silence, how deeply unfair it was to be written out of everything after years of trying to forge a relationship, however fragmented. I told him I didn't want his money. Not really, I wanted acknowledgement, legitimacy, to be seen, to be heard. I mailed it by hand. Tracked it. It was received. I got no reply. A week later, I got a call not from my father, but from his executive assistant, the same one who used to call me the other Miss Madison in emails. "Hi, Chloe. Mr. Madison asked me to let you know that, moving forward, all family communications regarding business or estate matters should go through the firm." Oh, I laughed. I actually laughed because it was so surreal, so sterile, so cowardly. He couldn't even say it himself. But the final straw one that broke whatever fragile thread of loyalty I had left came from Meredith. She sent me an email, completely unsolicited, no subject line, just a cold paragraph that read, "Chloe, I understand you may be upset, but continuing to push this narrative publicly or within the family could cause unnecessary distress. I encourage you to respect the decisions made. Stirring tension won't change the past, and it won't benefit your future." It was a warning. Veiled, but unmistakable. I was being told to fall in line. To be quiet. Again. For the sake of appearances, for the sake of the people who had always looked through me like glass. But I was done playing the ghost. That night, I opened my laptop. I started writing everything down: the meetings I was excluded from, the clauses in the trust that had been changed, the messages left unanswered, the documents I had kept over the years, and most importantly, the truth about my mother and the promises my father had made to her before she died. I had proof. I had timelines. I had emails and notes and even a voice message he once left in a rare moment of guilt, saying, "I know I wasn't a good father to you, Chloe. I'll make it right someday." Well, someday had come, and I was going to make sure the world heard what he wouldn't say. I don't know when exactly I made the decision to stop being the forgotten daughter and start becoming the one who told the truth, but once it clicked into place, something shifted inside me, like a steel door slowly creaking open after years of rust, letting in the kind of air that stings your lungs at first but reminds you you're still alive. I didn't feel brave at the beginning, only determined, stubborn, maybe, tired for sure, but that tiredness had weight, and that weight gave me traction. And if they weren't going to see me for who I was, then I would show them in a way they couldn't unsee. I started small. I gathered everything, every letter, every birthday card, every voicemail, every email, even the old faded photos of my mother and Charles during those few brief years when it must have been real. Or at least real enough to leave traces. I found the copy of my birth certificate, the original legal documents from when my mother petitioned for child support, the court transcripts from the hearings they tried so hard to pretend never happened. I scanned everything into neatly labeled folders on my laptop, a digital archive of my existence, my evidence, my story. It wasn't about revenge, at least not yet. It was about reclaiming the parts of my life that had been quietly erased, rewritten, softened, or ignored by people who had power over the narrative for far too long. Then I made an appointment with a lawyer, not one of the flashy corporate ones that sit in downtown high-rises behind mahogany desks, but a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Fiona Dawes, who specialized in estate litigation and had a reputation for handling family ghosts, as she called clients like me, the ones who were never supposed to speak. She listened as I laid everything out, one piece at a time, her eyes calm and unblinking, occasionally tapping notes on a yellow legal pad, her silence oddly comforting. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and said, "They've underestimated you. That's their first mistake." I felt something stir in my chest at those words, not pride exactly, but a kind of quiet strength, like maybe I wasn't crazy to want this, to fight for my place, to refuse to be hidden anymore. Fiona told me we had a case. Not just for breach of implied agreement based on past communications, but potentially even grounds for contesting the updated estate documents if we could show manipulation or undue influence. Words like intentional exclusion, pattern of deceptive conduct and misrepresentation filled the air between us, and while I didn't understand every legal nuance, I understood enough to know I wasn't powerless. In the days that followed, I started doing something else, something scarier, something that made my heart race, but also made my hands feel steady. For the first time in weeks, I started talking. I reached out to former employees of my father's company who had known my mother back in the day, people who had been around when Charles was still sneaking off to meet her on overnight business trips. When I was just a toddler sitting on her lap in break rooms while she waited for her connecting flights. I spoke with a retired secretary named Ellen who remembered seeing photos of me on my father's desk. Before Meredith found out and made him take them down, she said, her voice hushed, like she was afraid the memory itself might hurt someone. I spoke to an old friend of my mother's, who confirmed that Charles had promised to include me in the family trust once the timing was right. I gathered these statements like breadcrumbs, each one leading me back to the truth I already knew in my bones. I had never been an accident. I had simply been inconvenient. Meanwhile, I kept flying. It was the only thing that still felt clean, untouched by the family rot. I'd take off from the tarmac and look down at the lights below and think about how far I'd come, just, literally, in miles, but emotionally, spiritually. The cockpit became my sanctuary, the checklist my prayer, the altitude my balm. Up there, no one could reduce me to a scandal or a stain. Up there, I was Captain Chloe Madison, and every passenger who stepped off my flight safely was another reminder that I was more than their rejection. But even as I worked behind the scenes with Fiona, even as I prepared my legal counterattack, I also tried one more time to speak directly to my father. To appeal to the man I had once believed might eventually do the right thing, not because he was forced to, but because somewhere, buried under decades of silence and avoidance, there was a sliver of decency left in him. I sent him one final letter. I didn't beg. I didn't rage. I just told him the truth. Dear Charles, I'm not asking for your money. I'm asking for you to tell the truth. About me. About my mother. About the promises you made and the life you helped create. I've spent my life trying to earn something that should have been given freely. Acknowledgement. I've lived quietly, respectfully, and still, I was erased. I will not be quiet anymore. I hope you understand what that means. He didn't reply, not in words. But a few days later, I got a call from an unfamiliar number. When I answered, it was Meredith. I suggest you stop this now, Chloe, she said, her voice like cold glass. Dragging this through the courts, airing dirty laundry, it won't end well for anyone. Least of all you. She hung up before I could say a word. That was her warning. Her threat. But instead of scaring me, it confirmed what I already knew. They were nervous. They saw me now. Not as a daughter, not even as a person, but as a threat. And for the first time, I didn't feel small or pitied or discarded. I felt powerful. Because I had the truth. And I was just getting started. I always thought the hardest part would be the silence, the years of being ignored and quietly excluded, but what no one prepares you for is what happens when the silence ends, when you finally speak, and your voice, no matter how calm or reasonable, is met not with understanding or even confusion, but with rage. Rage that you dared to break the rules they never let you write, that you stepped into a room you were never allowed in, that you made yourself seen after years of being their secret, their stain, the daughter they never wanted to admit. After I filed the legal paperwork contesting the will, the air shifted. I could feel it not just around me, but within me. My phone, once silent for weeks, suddenly lit up with calls and messages, not from people offering support, but from relatives I barely knew, reminding me that I was digging up old wounds, stirring up things that should stay buried, or the worst one, doing this for attention. That one came from my Aunt Leslie, my father's older sister, a woman I had spoken to perhaps 4 times in my life. She left me a voicemail saying, "Chloe, I don't know what you think you're doing, but your mother is gone, and she wouldn't want you poisoning the family with this drama. Please, for everyone's sake, let it go. Let it go." As if I were holding on to something petty. As if decades of exclusion, dismissal, and erasure could be tucked away like laundry in a drawer. The following week, Fiona called to inform me that a mediation had been proposed at a meeting between my father's side, their lawyers, and myself to discuss concerns and avoid escalation. Though everyone knew that what they really wanted was to intimidate me, corner me into withdrawing the case quietly so they wouldn't have to drag their polished legacy through the courts. I agreed to the meeting. We met in a neutral space, a law office downtown with 2 white walls and fake plants that smelled like antiseptic. I arrived first, my palms damp with sweat despite the air conditioning. Fiona sat beside me, calm, collected, her legal pad resting in her lap. When the door opened, they filed in like royalty. Charles in a dark suit, jaw clenched, eyes tired. Meredith right behind him, poised in a cream blouse and diamond earrings, her expression one of thinly veiled disdain. Liam in his tailored arrogance, nodding stiffly like he was doing me a favor just by being in the same room. And Grace, trailing behind, head down, looking like she would rather be anywhere else. No one said hello. Not even my father. The mediator introduced herself, a woman named Karen with gentle eyes and a firm voice. She reminded everyone that we were here to resolve conflict, not inflame it. I nodded. No one else did. I began, because no one else seemed willing. I kept my voice steady, even when my heart was thudding in my chest like a second heartbeat. I'm not here because I want to fight, I said. I'm here because I've been ignored my entire life. I've asked for nothing, I've worked for everything I have, and yet you all treat me like a threat just for existing. Meredith was the first to respond, her voice cool and sharp. No one treats you like a threat, Chloe. But you weren't part of the family dynamic. You chose to live your life separate from us. I was never invited to be part of the family, I said, my voice cracking. You called me a reminder. You wouldn't even look at me for years. I'm a new... Liam spoke next, his tone professional but cold. This isn't personal. It's about the company, the legacy. You're not involved in that. I could have been, I snapped. If anyone had ever offered a hand instead of turning their backs. My father remained silent. I turned to him. Dad, do you really think this is fair? That it's right? He looked at me then, really looked at me, and for a second I saw something flicker behind his eyes, guilt, maybe, or memory, but it vanished as quickly as it came. I made the decisions I felt were best for everyone, he said flatly. Everyone? I asked. You mean Meredith, Liam, Grace. Not me. The mediator stepped in then, trying to calm the temperature in the room, asking us all to focus on solutions. Fiona presented a structured offer for partial recognition, citing documented communications and implied intent, but it was clear from the body language across the table that nothing would be considered. They weren't here to compromise, they were here to make me back down. Meredith leaned in. Chloe, continuing this will only bring you more pain. Is that really what you want? I've been in pain my whole life, I said. The only difference now is I'm not pretending anymore. That on off, we broke for recess. In the hallway, my father approached me. I braced myself. You don't understand the pressure I was under, he said softly. Meredith, the company, this wasn't about you. It was always about me, I whispered. You just didn't want to admit that I mattered. His face twisted, like he wanted to argue, but he didn't. He turned and walked away. That night, I went home and sat in the dark, the city lights blinking silently through my windows, and I felt something I hadn't expected: grief, not for what I had lost, but for what I never had to begin with. A real father. A real family. The kind that looks out for you even when it's hard. And for a moment, I broke. I cried, not the clean, movie-type crying, but the kind that comes from deep inside, shaking, silent, helpless sobs that make your ribs hurt. Because standing up for yourself doesn't mean you stop wishing things had been different. But even in the pain, I felt something else: clarity. They weren't going to accept me willingly. They never had. And I couldn't make them see what they refused to see. But I could speak. I could tell the truth. I could shine a light on every shadow they tried to keep hidden. And I would. There is a kind of pain that doesn't scream, it hums, quietly, insistently, like a dull ache deep inside your chest that you can't massage away. A sorrow that takes up residence inside your bones and waits, not loudly, but patiently, for the exact moment you sit still long enough for it to rise up and take hold. And that was how the days passed after the mediation meeting. After the look in my father's eyes confirmed what I had feared all along, that I could speak, I could plead, I could put every truth in front of him like broken glass on a table, but he would still look away, pretending he didn't see the blood on his hands. I would lie in bed long past morning, the light bleeding in through the curtains like an accusation, the air in my apartment thick with the kind of silence that doesn't comfort but chokes. I stopped flying. I called in sick the first time, then took unpaid leave the second, my voice flat and tired as I told my airline supervisor that I just needed time, that I couldn't focus in the cockpit when everything in my heart was falling apart. I knew they understood pilots don't fly when they're unwell, but I hated the way my voice sounded, weak and cracked, like something soft left out in the rain. My friends checked in at first. Rachel called twice a day, then once a day, then just left messages, but I stopped answering. I didn't know how to talk about what I was feeling, didn't know how to say that even after all these years, even after all the distance and disappointment, there was still this child inside me screaming. Why didn't he choose me? Why didn't anyone fight for me? And what do you say to that, really? What words do you offer someone who is grieving a family that never wanted them to begin with? I tried to distract myself with tasks: cleaning the apartment, organizing drawers that hadn't been touched in years, rereading my old logbooks from flight school, but nothing stuck. Food tasted like cardboard. Water felt too heavy in my stomach. Sleep, when it came, brought dreams of my mother calling my name from far away, always just out of reach, always fading into mist before I could get to her. And yet, even in that darkness, I kept every voicemail, every letter, every legal document. I didn't shred anything. I didn't delete a single file. Because part of me knew this wasn't the end. Part of me knew that I wasn't done, and not really. I was just broken, for now. Exhausted. Hollowed out by years of emotional starvation. But I was still breathing, and if I was still breathing, then there was still a fight left in me. I just didn't know how to access it yet. Then came the message. I was curled up on the couch one night, wrapped in a blanket that still smelled faintly of the detergent my mother used, when my phone buzzed. I almost didn't check it. I'd grown used to letting everything go to voicemail, but something nudged me. When I looked, it was from Grace. Just 2 words. I'm sorry. No punctuation, no explanation, just that. I stared at it for a long time, fingers hovering over the keyboard, not knowing whether to reply or let it be. I didn't trust it. I didn't know what she meant. Was she apologizing for the inheritance? For the meeting? For the years of pretending I didn't exist unless it was convenient for her? Or was this just guilt, cheap and too late? I didn't respond. Not yet. Instead, I opened a drawer in my mother's old writing desk, a drawer I had avoided for months. Inside was a folder labeled, Charles. I had never read it all. I think some part of me was scared of what it might confirm, that she had once believed in him, that she had been just as hurt when he turned his back on us. But I read it now. Every line. Letters she had written to him and never sent. Notes from the lawyer. Printouts of emails where she begged for child support before she had to take him to court. Her handwriting was firm, strong, full of restraint, but heartbreakingly clear. Chloe doesn't need your money, Charles. She needs her father. If you can't be that for her, at least don't pretend she doesn't exist. I folded the pages back into the folder and wept, not the clean kind of crying that you see in movies, but the kind that comes from someplace too deep to name, the kind where your whole body shudders and your throat burns and your breath comes in gasps because you're mourning not just what you lost, but everything you never had. I cried for her, for my mother who raised me without help, who protected me from the truth for as long as she could, who died too young with too many things left unsaid. I cried for the girl I had been, hopeful, obedient, always waiting for a phone call, for a visit, for a sign that I mattered. And in that grief, something else took root. Not anger, not yet, but clarity. They had robbed me, yes, but not just of money or status or a seat at the table. They had robbed me of time, of trust, of peace. They had manipulated the silence so expertly that I had doubted myself, doubted my worth, doubted whether I had the right to speak at all. But I did. I had every right. And grief, while cruel and heavy, has a strange way of refining things. It strips away the illusions, the politeness, the need to be liked. And what was left in me, after the crying and the shaking and the silence, was something sharp, something focused. I was not going to let them rewrite my story. I was not going to disappear quietly so they could go on living their polished, curated lives without the inconvenience of my truth. I stood up, wiped my face, and pulled out my laptop. I opened the folder marked Case Evidence and began organizing files not just for Fiona, not just for the lawsuit, but for me. For the record. For the day I would make sure my voice was heard, and the world would know exactly who the Madisons really were beneath the expensive suits and the country club smiles. They told me not to speak, but I was going to. And this time, I wasn't going to stop. There's something about silence that doesn't just settle over you, it grows inside you. At first, I thought the hardest part was being excluded from the will, from the family, from the narrative they tell about themselves at country clubs and business galas, but I was wrong. The hardest part was what came after I spoke up. After I made my presence undeniable. Because the silence that followed wasn't indifferent anymore, it was full of intention, full of the weight of people turning their backs and pretending not to see me, not hear me, not feel the ripple of truth I had started to send through the perfect surface of their lives. I tried to function. I really did. I woke up every morning and put my feet on the floor like that act alone could reattach me to something solid. I brushed my teeth, I made coffee, I even answered work emails like I wasn't unraveling one thread at a time. But there was a moment, every single day, where I would feel it, that slow, creeping despair that wraps itself around your ribs and whispers that maybe this is all you'll ever be. The girl who wasn't chosen. The daughter who was left off the guest list. The pilot who could land a plane in a thunderstorm but couldn't get a seat at her own father's table. I stopped flying. I told my airline I needed time. And they gave it to me kindly, professionally. But I hated the way my supervisor's voice changed when he heard mine, how he softened it like I might break, like he was talking to someone who'd lost something important, and I guess I had. I'd lost the illusion I had clung to my entire life that if I just worked harder, just stayed quiet, just didn't make waves, they would eventually see me. Eventually accept me. But the mediation meeting had burned that fantasy to the ground. My father hadn't defended me, he hadn't even tried to understand. And Liam, Grace, Meredith, they looked at me like I was invading something sacred, something that never belonged to me in the first place. I stopped answering Rachel's calls. Not because I didn't love her, I did, but because I didn't have the words. What could I say? That I felt like a ghost in my own life? That every room I entered felt colder now, like some part of me had gone numb for good? That even food tasted different, and the light through my window felt like it belonged to someone else? I knew she'd worry, but I also knew she couldn't fix this. No one could. I spent a lot of time staring at the ceiling. It sounds stupid, but I did. Just lying there, in that in-between state where time folds in on itself and nothing makes sense. I thought about my mother a lot. About how hard she had tried to protect me from this exact moment, though she shielded me from the truth, softened it with stories and small joys, how she never badmouthed my father, even when she could have. She used to say, "Some people love in broken ways, Chloe. You just have to decide what kind of love you're willing to accept." And I used to nod, pretending I understood, but I didn't. Not really. Not until now. Because this wasn't broken love. It wasn't love at all. It was omission. It was shame. And the longer I sat with it, the more I began to realize how deep that shame went, not mine, but theirs. My existence forced them to look at a version of Charles Madison they didn't want the world to see. A version that had lied, cheated, made a mess he never cleaned up. I was proof that the Madisons weren't perfect. I was the living consequence of a choice they wanted to pretend never happened. And so they erased me. Not with cruelty. That would have been easier to fight. They erased me with silence. With distance. with careful, calculated omissions. Until even I began to question if I was real. I remember one night, around 2 in the morning, I opened my mother's old jewelry box. It still smelled faintly like her perfume. Inside was a velvet pouch, and inside that, a thin gold chain with a tiny airplane charm. She gave it to me when I passed my flight test. I hadn't worn it in years. I put it on that night and just sat there, staring at myself in the mirror. My eyes were puffy, my skin pale, my hair pulled back in a messy bun. But the charm gleamed. Small, but certain. And for the first time in days, I felt something like presence. I didn't sleep that night, but I did start writing. Not legal drafts. Not statements. Just words. Memories. Fragments. The way my mother used to sing while folding laundry. The way I felt at 16 when I got my first solo flight clearance. The sound of my father's voice the one time he told me he was proud. He didn't say it in person, just in a voicemail, almost by accident, but I'd saved it anyway. And as I wrote, I realized I wasn't disappearing. I was mourning. There's a difference. Disappearing is when you give up. Mourning is when you give yourself permission to grieve what you lost, what you never had, what you deserved but were denied. I wrote until the sun came up. I drank tea in silence and watched the sky turn pink. And I decided quietly, without fanfare, that I wasn't going to let them decide what part I played in my own life. They could have their silence, their money, their curated reputation. But I had my voice. And I was just getting started. Some truths don't arrive in sudden flashes, they rise, slowly, like a tide, pulling at your ankles before you even realize the ground beneath you has shifted. That's what it felt like when I found the letter in the back of my mother's drawer, a yellowed envelope with my name written in her careful, elegant script, one I hadn't seen since she passed. I hadn't even been looking for it. I was reaching for a spare phone charger when the drawer jammed and I tugged harder, knocking loose a false bottom I'd never noticed before. Inside, along with a few old receipts and faded Polaroids, was a letter and a folded page marked Whitmore Trust, 2000. I stared at the name for a long time, feeling the weight of something I didn't yet understand settle into my chest. The letter was addressed to a woman named Margaret Whitmore, mother's handwriting formal, deliberate. It didn't take long to realize that Margaret had once been my father's personal attorney. What took my breath away was what the letter revealed. That my father had set up a financial trust in my name shortly after I was born. A trust meant to be part of my future. A trust I had never known existed. He had tried to hide me, yes. But apparently, he had also tried to ease his guilt with money he made sure I never knew about. My hands trembled as I held the letter. The kind of trembling that comes not from fear, but from the sudden realization that the foundation of your entire life has a crack so wide. Everything you thought you knew is about to come undone. I found Margaret. She was retired, living in Connecticut, and when I called her, she remembered my mother instantly. There was a long pause on the other end of the line when I told her who I was, and then she said, with surprising gentleness, "I always wondered if you'd come looking." The next day, I boarded a flight and met her in person. She welcomed me into her home like I was family, like I was someone who had always belonged somewhere. She poured tea without asking if I wanted it, and sat across from me with a folder she'd kept for over 20 years. "It's all in here," she said, her voice steady but sad. "Your mother was brave. She knew you deserved more than scraps, but Charles was so determined to protect his image. He didn't want a scandal, so he asked me to make the trust quiet." "Silent, you mean," I said. "Yes. Legally protected, but socially invisible." I opened the folder, and there it was, proof. Bank documents, initial trust agreements, correspondence that confirmed everything I had begun to suspect. He had made provisions. He had created legal pathways. But then he had locked every door behind him and thrown away the key. My stomach twisted, not because I wanted the money, but because this meant he hadn't just forgotten me. He had remembered. He had cared, in his own stunted, broken way. And still, he had chosen silence. Still, he had chosen Meredith's comfort over my presence. Still, He had chosen shame over acknowledgement. "I want to fight this," I said, looking up at Margaret. She nodded. "Then we'll fight." That moment sitting in a stranger's living room, holding a piece of my histories, was the beginning of everything changing. Margaret and Fiona joined forces, combing through documents, building a timeline, laying out a case that made it undeniably clear that not only had I been deliberately excluded, but that my exclusion was rooted in concealment, manipulation, and decades of fear. The first legal filing caused a stir. Subtle at first, just a phone call from my father's assistant requesting a private meeting to discuss matters discreetly. I declined. The second filing gone that publicly named Charles Madison and referenced the trust set off a chain reaction. Reporters started sniffing. Old acquaintances reached out. I got a message from a former employee of my father's company who said, "Everyone knew, they just didn't say it out loud." That was when I realized I wasn't just breaking a silence, I was shattering a pact. But what made it real, what made it personal, was the call I got from Liam. "You're really going to drag all of us through the mud?" he said, his voice tight, clipped, furious. "You did that," I answered, calm now. "When you pretended I didn't exist. I warned you this would hurt more than help. It already hurts, you just got used to not seeing it." He hung up. But I didn't shake. Not this time. Because I had something they didn't. I had the truth, and I had nothing left to lose. I thought I had imagined every version of how it could happen, how the truth might finally tear through their silence like a lightning bolt splitting a storm, but nothing prepared me for the weight of the actual moment. Standing face to face with the people who had shaped my life through absence more than presence, through careful omission rather than outright cruelty, surrounded by lawyers and legal pads and the sharp scent of judgment lingering in the air of that courtroom, like a wound waiting to reopen. The courtroom wasn't grand or dramatic, not the kind of space you'd expect for such a long-awaited reckoning. It was cold, institutional, beige walls and metal chairs and fluorescent lights that flattened everyone's features into something gray and tired. And maybe that was fitting. Because what we were about to do wasn't about spectacle. It was about truth. It was about forcing into daylight what they had all spent decades keeping in the dark. Charles sat across from me at the defendant's table, flanked by his legal team, looking every bit the powerful executive in his custom-tailored suit and perfectly knotted tie, but his posture betrayed him. Shoulders too still, jaw too tight, eyes flickering down every few minutes like he was bracing for something he couldn't control. Meredith was there too, of course, her expression stiff, her gaze fixed on a spot somewhere above my head as if looking directly at me might shatter the illusion she had spent her life maintaining. Liam sat beside her, arms crossed, jaw clenched, looking like he wanted to be anywhere else, and Grace didn't look at anyone. Her hands trembled slightly in her lap. When the judge called the court to order, I felt my heart pounding in my ears, not out of fear anymore, but from the sheer magnitude of what was finally about to be said aloud. Fiona spoke first, her voice calm and cutting as she laid out the timeline, the trust that had been created in my name and quietly buried, the legal correspondences with Margaret Whitmore that proved it, the deliberate omission from the estate despite prior commitments made in writing, the long trail of avoidance and manipulation that, when viewed in full, painted a damning picture of intent. Then came the letters, my mother's, Margaret's, even emails from Charles himself, some polite and distant, others careless and damning. The kind you only write when you think no one will ever hold you accountable. The room was still as Fiona read aloud the line from one particular email. "I've done what I can for Chloe behind the scenes, but Meredith cannot know about the trust. She won't accept it." And then another. "Make sure this stays quiet." When my turn came to speak, I stood slowly, feeling every eye in the room land on me, but I didn't look at them, not yet. I looked at the judge, and I began to speak the truth I had carried inside me for over 2 decades. I am not here today because I want revenge. I am here because I want acknowledgement, I said, my voice steady but full. My mother raised me on her own, with dignity and strength, while my father made quiet arrangements that he never intended me to know. About arrangements that acknowledged me on paper but denied me in person. I was never invited into their lives, but I was watched from a distance, managed like a liability. And now I am here because I will no longer be treated like a secret. I finally turned to look at my father, and I said, "You didn't have to give me everything. You didn't even have to love me the way I deserved. But you could have told the truth. You could have admitted I was yours, fully and publicly, instead of hiding me behind legal walls." He said nothing. He didn't even flinch. The judge asked if he wished to respond. He stood, slowly, cleared his throat, and said, "My decisions were complicated. My intentions were never to cause harm." But it was too late for that. The judge didn't need long. He ruled in my favor, citing clear evidence of intent to suppress and conceal, affirming that the trust would be restored to me in full, and stating on the record that my exclusion from the estate had been unjustified based on the documentation provided. But no legal victory could match what came next. As we gathered our papers, preparing to leave the courtroom, Grace stood. Her voice was shaky, but she spoke anyway. "Chloe," she said, "I knew about the trust. I found the documents 2 years ago. I didn't say anything because I didn't want to lose my place with them, and I'm sorry." The room went completely still. Meredith turned toward her, her expression full of icy horror, but Grace didn't stop. She turned to the judge. "I want to make a statement for the record," she said. "I support Chloe's claim, and I regret not speaking sooner." It didn't change the ruling, but it changed everything. Because for the first time, I wasn't alone. And for the first time, someone inside that family said my name not as a threat, but as a sister. There are victories that make noise, that echo across headlines and screens and stir up strangers' opinions like dust in sunlight. And then there are victories that arrive in quiet, private waves, so soft, so personal, so deeply rooted in your ribs that the only sound they make is your own breath catching, because you realize, finally, you won. You were right. You were never the crazy one. Never the troublemaker. Never the mistake. In the days following the ruling, the house I'd built from resilience rather than wood felt warmer than it ever had, and it wasn't because I'd suddenly come into money, or because I was now officially recognized in legal paperwork or family trust records, but because for the first time in my life, I was no longer hiding inside someone else's story. The silence that had once defined me had been broken, and what replaced it was something solid and undeniable. News of the case, of course, spread quickly, faster than I could control, and wider than I expected. My name was mentioned in industry blogs, quiet corners of aviation, Twitter. Even a segment on a late-night business program called me the heir they tried to forget. Most of it was sensationalized, bits of my life repackaged into a compelling headline or moral tale. But buried in the noise were also messages from people I never expected: former colleagues of my father, women who had known my mother, a retired flight instructor who remembered me as the girl with fire in her gut and steel in her hands, and perhaps most importantly, other daughters and sons who had grown up in the shadows of wealthy families, erased by scandal, hidden by shame, and made to feel like ghosts in their own bloodline. One message I will never forget came from a woman named Ellen, who wrote, "I wasn't brave enough to do what you did. I hope you know what you've done is bigger than you." It made me cry, not the heavy, broken sobs of before, but the kind of crying that feels like release, like water finally finding its way through stone. My father didn't speak to the press, not once. He issued a short statement through his attorney, citing a complex and private family matter and asking for respect during this time of transition. Transition, I thought. What a convenient word. Like the unraveling of decades of control was just another season. Meredith disappeared from the spotlight altogether, retreating to their Vermont estate, and Liam never reached out, never apologized, never even acknowledged the ruling, which honestly didn't surprise me. He was the same person who once told me, "This isn't personal," as he signed documents that erased me. But Grace did. And that, more than any press release or settlement figure, meant something real. She texted the day after the ruling. "I don't expect forgiveness. But if you ever want to talk, I'm here. Really here. And We met a week later at a park near where we used to go as kids during those awkward, short-lived visitations when I was allowed into their world for a few carefully monitored hours. She brought coffee. I brought silence. For a while, we just sat there, watching people pass, the wind pushing leaves into small spirals at our feet. "I was scared," she said finally, quietly. "Not of you, never of you. I was scared of losing everything that made me feel safe. And I'm so sorry for letting that fear keep me quiet." I didn't say anything for a long time because there was nothing easy or clever to say. But eventually, I nodded, and that was enough for now. Meanwhile, I returned to flying. I had missed it more than I realized. The hum of the engine, the checklist routines. The way the sky opens up when you climb out of low weather and into clear blue, it felt like coming home to a part of myself I had set aside while fighting for the one that had been buried. And I didn't stop with the courtroom. With Fiona and Margaret's help, I began speaking publicly at women's conferences, at legal ethics panels, at aviation leadership events, not because I wanted attention, but because I knew that my story was not mine alone. Every time I stood in front of a crowd and told them what it was like to grow up as a whisper in someone else's legacy, I saw heads nodding, tears welling, hands clenching in recognition. We were everywhere, the forgotten daughters, the inconvenient truths, the buried bloodlines, and we were finally speaking. The trust fund was reinstated. A formal amendment to the estate acknowledged my name alongside Grace and Liam's. It was cold, official language. Chloe Madison shall be entitled to a 1/3 share. But I printed it anyway and framed it, not because I cared about the money, but because for the first time, my name was where it belonged. In ink, not erased. In permanent record. And for the first time in a long time, I began to imagine a future that didn't revolve around proving I existed. I imagined building a scholarship in my mother's name for young women in aviation. I imagined writing a book. I imagined, maybe, loving someone without the constant fear of being left unseen. I didn't win back a family. That was never the point. But I won back myself. And no one could take that from me again. The strange thing about peace is that it doesn't come with fanfare, no loud declarations, no dramatic sunrise that signals everything is finally okay, arrives quietly, gradually, in the smallest of moments, like waking up one morning and realizing your chest doesn't ache anymore when you hear their names, or noticing that the silence in your apartment no longer feels hollow but rather full, steady, and yours. After everything, the courtroom, the statements, the interviews, the long nights lying awake rehearsing every painful memory just to prove they happened, life began to shift, not all at once, but like the sea pulling back after a long storm, leaving behind pieces of wreckage and glimmers of possibility in its place. I went back to flying, not because I had to, but because I wanted to feel like myself again. Because there was still something sacred to me about lifting a plane into the sky and watching the world grow small beneath my feet, something healing about the way altitude puts things into perspective, about the way you can leave behind the chaos of the earth for just a few hours and remember what it means to be weightless. And in that first flight back, I cried not because I was sad, but because I had found my way home to the part of me that had always kept me grounded even when everything else was breaking apart. The trust fund gave me stability, yes, but it was never about the money, it was about legitimacy, about being written back into the story from which I had been erased, about seeing my name on documents that once pretended I didn't exist, about having proof that I wasn't crazy, I wasn't bitter, I wasn't wrong for wanting to belong. I used part of it to create the Eleanor Madison Foundation, a scholarship for young women in aviation, especially those who came from single-parent homes like mine. Because I knew how hard my mother had fought to make sure I never felt less than, and I wanted her name to live on in something more than grief and memory. Rachel, who had never once abandoned me during the whole ordeal, helped me design the Foundation's first program. She told me over coffee one morning, "You realize you've turned your pain into purpose, right?" And I smiled, because it finally felt true. We laughed that day, real laughter that didn't feel forced, and it occurred to me that I hadn't felt light like that in years. Grace and I met again, more than once. It was tentative at first, like walking on thawing ice, both of us afraid to say the wrong thing, but slowly we found our footing. She told me stories about our childhood side by side separated, yet parallel, and she apologized in ways that weren't just words but choices, choosing to sit beside me at family events, choosing to correct people when they introduced her as the only daughter, choosing to say my name like it mattered. It didn't undo everything, but it gave us something to rebuild with, and for the first time, I allowed myself to believe that maybe not all of them had wanted to keep me out. Maybe some of them had just been too scared to break the rules they didn't write. My father never called. He didn't send a letter, didn't email, didn't reach out through a third party. And surprisingly, I didn't need him to. Because by then, I had stopped looking for closure in his hands. By then, I had given it to myself. I moved into a new apartment, one with wide windows and an open kitchen and space for plants, which I promised myself I'd try not to kill. I filled it with photos not just of my mother, but of myself at every age, photos I had once kept tucked away like I was ashamed to remember the girl I used to be. Now, I displayed them proudly, each one a reminder of everything I had survived, everything I had carried alone, and everything I had become. I started writing, to not just journals or legal affidavits, but real writing. Pages that told the whole story, not just the legal one, but the emotional one, the human one, the kind that might one day help someone else who was being told, like I had been, to stay quiet, to let it go, to not make waves. And in that writing, I found a voice I didn't know I had. Not the voice of the forgotten daughter, not the outsider banging on the locked door of legacy, but the voice of a woman who had walked through fire and found, on the other side, something like peace. Not perfect peace, but enough. Enough to sleep through the night without waking up from dreams of being left behind. Enough to make plans without wondering if I was allowed to. Enough to smile when I said my own name. Chloe Madison. Not a mistake, not an afterthought, not an asterisk. Just Chloe. And finally, that was enough. It's strange, the way life unfolds not in grand, sweeping gestures, but in the quiet moments that follow the storm, when the dust settles and you're left with the raw, unvarnished truth of who you are and what you've endured. I find myself reflecting on the path that led me here, to this place of hard-won peace, and I realize that the most profound transformations often come not from the battles we fight, but from the resilience we discover within ourselves. There was a time when I believed that love and validation had to be earned, that I needed to contort myself into shapes that fit others' expectations, that silence was safer than truth. But standing up for myself, reclaiming my narrative, and confronting the painful realities of my past taught me otherwise. I learned that my worth isn't determined by others' acceptance or acknowledgement, but by my own unwavering belief in my value and dignity. The journey wasn't easy. It was fraught with heartache, betrayal, and moments of profound doubt. But through it all, I discovered a strength I never knew I possessed, a resilience forged in the crucible of adversity. I found my voice, not in shouting over others, but in speaking my truth with clarity and conviction. I found peace, not in forgetting the past, but in making peace with it. As I look ahead, I carry with me the lessons of this journey. That healing is possible, that justice is worth pursuing, and that embracing one's truth is the most liberating act of all. I know there will be challenges ahead, but I face them with a newfound confidence, grounded in the knowledge that I have already overcome so much. To anyone who has ever felt unseen, unheard, or unworthy, I offer this. Your story matters. Your voice matters. And you have the power to redefine your narrative, to rise above the pain, and to claim the life you deserve. It won't be easy, but it will be worth it. As for me, I continue to live each day with intention and gratitude, cherishing the freedom that comes from authenticity and the peace that comes from self-acceptance. My journey is far from over, but I embrace it with open arms, ready to face whatever comes next with courage and grace. In the end, I am not defined by the wounds inflicted upon me, but by the strength I've found in healing them. And that, I believe, is the truest victory of all.